Hello, I'm Darkwell Bled and welcome back to Beyond the Rusted Gate. If you feel like you're standing on the precipice right now, it might be because today's story is The Call to the Void. Charles lay on his side in the lumpy, sweat-stained bed of his apartment, eyes open, awoken by a buzz from without that was more often a hum from within. His head pounded and he had the sweats. Charles was hungover. He quickly assessed, extremely hungover. Charles' head pounded from the booze, though it usually hummed, and the hum from within was now replaced by a buzz from beyond. As per normal, his bedroom was overly warm. The air conditioner had never worked and the landlord had never cared. In summer, the apartment was prone to bugs, spiders, and flies. They came through the windows that could not seal tightly, under the drafty doors, and through the cracks in the walls that led into other apartments. The bedroom was overly warm, the apartment was overly musty, the carpet had mold, and Charles had a hangover. Charles could not remember how he had gotten home. Being in his home without remembering how he had gotten there was a fascinating and somewhat terrifying oddity. Charles didn't drink anymore. It had been years since Charles had even touched a drop, let alone allowed himself to become blackout drunk. Despite this, blackout drunk was something Charles had evidently become. How his night had ended was a mystery veiled in the darkness of total inebriation. He wasn't one to trust himself drunk. He wasn't even one to trust himself sober. And what antics he may have gotten up to when in the autopilot state of his worst vices worried him greatly. Closing his eyes, Charles attempted to reconstruct how the night had progressed and how the day preceding it had begun. With effort, he forced his thoughts past the pounding headache and the strange buzzing. His memories were disordered. Yesterday could have easily been childhood, and childhood could have easily been yesterday. Charles sometimes felt himself a time traveler, capable of seamlessly placing himself mentally back in time to re-experience his own memories exactly as though they were initially unfolding. However, with the headache and the buzzing, he found that today his thoughts disobeyed him. They took him to wherever in time they pleased. They jumbled, fought for primacy, and were given free range within his muddled mind. Charles was 5. There hadn't been a buzzing then, that had only come this morning, but he had always hummed. In childhood, Charles assumed that all children hummed. He had no frame of reference, so how was he to know that an ever-present hum that urged and inspired was an abnormality? Children only know what they are told, and in the same way that he had never questioned why it was that he became tired towards the end of the day, he had never questioned why there was a hum. It was a dull vibration that compelled him to action. Action that would often lead to trouble. It urged him to draw on walls and insisted that he pull on Gel's hair, but was never anything that Charles had ever given much thought to. The hum, so far as Charles was aware, simply was. The room smelt of mold and sweat and filth, and amongst the odors that usually assaulted him upon awakening within his run-down fire-trap of an apartment was another scent that he could not place. It was one that he had smelt before, though he was unsure of where or when. His mind tried in vain to place it, dancing over various experiences from camping to driving to fishing. He was in a coffee house and he was at a funeral. Once a rat had died in the wall of his apartment, and when told of it, his landlord had simply said, "The smell will pass in time." The room vibrated with the buzz from beyond and his head pounded. The smell did not matter. It was just another addition to his already unpleasant state of living, and so, redirecting his mind back to the task at hand, Charles attempted to remember what had unfolded the night before. Charles was 20, and it was yesterday. It had been 8 a.m. Sunday morning when he had pushed his way through the paint-peeled door of his apartment and made his way down the dreary hallway towards the elevator. The small rusted number on his door claimed that he lived in apartment 2, but this was only because the 7 that once preceded the 2 had long since fallen off. The elevator began to move, and Charles swallowed the last of his breakfast, a piece of toast, as he descended the 7 floors to ground level. Church wouldn't start until 9 a.m., and it was only a 15-minute walk from his apartment, but Charles always aimed to get there early. He enjoyed the social aspects of the congregation that took place before church and usually tried to arrive early enough to talk with others before morning mass. As he had made his way to church, the hum of his mind had mixed with that of the traffic, but the recollection of both remembered sounds now struggled against the reality of his pounding headache and the unusual buzz. The room was hot, sticky, and noisy, and it was only through much mental effort that Charles was capable of conjuring forth his recollections. He struggled to maintain focus on just one as they skipped and jumbled through his mind. Charles was 7, and a friend had just informed him of an imaginary companion named Mr. Beetles. Mr. Beetles was a large purple giraffe with whom his friend claimed to have gone on many adventures. Then, just as now, the ever-present hum within Charles' mind had no such physical appearance as it was claimed Mr. Beetles had. Charles's humming had neither voice nor personality. When the hum spoke to Charles, it did not do so through any means of communication that he fully understood, but instead through compulsions that he either felt he couldn't or shouldn't ignore. These compulsions appeared within his mind, but felt as though they were not his own. They were, he felt, completely alien. Charles did not understand why his imaginary friend was so different and less describable than that of the other children's, but found himself comforted and normalized to know that he was not the only one who felt a presence that compelled him. Charles rolled onto his back and stared blankly at the ceiling. There was a stain above his bed that he could never quite explain. It appeared to be damp, always damp, but his apartment was not the top floor, and so what it was damp with, Charles was completely uncertain. When he had first noticed the stain, he had worried that the apartment above had left their tap on, and half expected the stain to continue to grow, sag the ceiling, and then finally collapse in on him. It never did grow any larger, nor did it ever dry. Pointing a torch directly at the stain made it glisten like a rainbow, revealing that it, whatever it was more grease than water. The landlord, when asked to investigate, repeatedly claimed that there was no such stain and had gone so far as to deny its existence, even as Charles stood with his finger pressed into its soggy, greasy dampness. Now, as Charles attempted once more to refocus his mind to the events of yesterday, he found himself staring into the shiny stain and wondering, not for the first time, if it were truly there. Charles was once again back in front of the Parkland Church, and it was once again Sunday. He claims that he always gets there early because he enjoys the company of the congregation. He has even often repeated this lie to himself. In truth, there was only one for whom his efforts were made in an attempt to see her. She had been sitting there on the bench outside the church as he had approached yesterday morning. She was sitting on the bench, and as the cool Sunday breeze blew through her hair, framed by the impressive masonry of the old building, she looked as though she were an angel. In a strange way, Charles saw both her and the church as one and the same, and felt them both to be equally his savior. It was only during church, and it was only while talking to Mandy, that his hum completely receded. No compulsion drove him during either of these two forms of worship, and it was only in these moments that he ever felt himself truly content. On that Sunday yesterday morning, they had made small talk while they waited for the large wooden doors to open. She had laughed when she was supposed to, and where his practice of their conversation had assured him she would. The doors had opened, and their conversation had been cut off, and the humming returned. It returned, and under its compulsion, Charles had asked Mandy to lunch. He had done so just as though it were no big deal, and as if he hadn't before pained himself over the thought of doing so, but never followed through. The hum was a compulsion that drove him further and harder than he could ever drive himself. Sometimes he called it his courage, though he knew such a label was dishonest. Courage was when you faced something despite its known adversity, but his compulsions were too often the creator of the adversities he faced. The hum had compelled Charles to ask Mandy to lunch that morning, just as the buzz from beyond now drove him to sit up in bed. Charles was 13, dismayed and alone. Making friends never appeared to be as easy as keeping them, and as he entered high school, all friendships he had formed in his younger years declined and dissipated. It was with increasing resignation that Charles found he had difficulty relating to the other children. Not least of his concerns was his discovery of their apparent abandonment of the notion of imaginary friends. They claimed proudly to have grown out of them, and mocked Charles for being slow to do so. This was a further frustration, as he had only deceitfully claimed in the first place that his compulsions had personality and form in order to fit in with theirs, and now, having maintained the claim, was mocked for it. In these years his humming grew louder and was increasingly difficult to deny. At age 15, when finally Charles felt himself entirely unable to ignore his compulsions, it was only fortuitous that he had already begun to be seen by staff members of the school as a constant target of bullying. The boy that Charles had taken to with a hammer in shop class had in actuality never once harassed Charles and was only the unfortunate target of his compulsions when finally the humming had grown far too loud and far too violent. In truth, Charles had liked the boy, but knew all too well the troubles that would come if he had said so. Taking a hammer to someone you liked unprovoked was just something that normal people didn't do. Charles knew this, but what could he do? He was already extremely unpopular, the other boys hated him, and the girls feared him. If he had admitted that the boy he hit had never bullied him and that the attack was entirely unprovoked, it would have raised too many questions. They would ask him why. They would learn about his hum. They would force him to see a doctor, the white coat funny farm variety, and he would be further ostracized, slapped with the label of some kind of embarrassing medical oddity called mad and nuts, and then no one would ever be his friend. Fearing such things, Charles made sure to agree with all that the teacher said of him and his victim. He agreed that he had been the subject of the boy's harassment for far too long, that the name-calling had turned physical, and that being the smaller of the pair, Charles had grabbed for the hammer to defend himself. "Don't take what he did too personally," one teacher had told Charles. "The boy just has no conscience." That was the first time Charles had heard the word, and asking what it meant was relieved to learn that it referred to, quote-unquote, that little voice in your head that guides you. Charles immediately became convinced that this conscience was merely an adult-friendly rebranding of the imaginary friend. While he still wasn't sure why his little voice never spoke to him in words, he was relieved once more that it was not just he who felt a presence within him, though he found it curious and alarming that only his appeared to drive him towards violence. In the wall of the sticky, smelly, bug-ridden apartment in which Charles now sat, there was a small fist-sized hole that he had punched 3 years earlier. He had done this for no other reason than that he had been compelled to do so, and that he knew the compulsion would not stop until he did. He had been 17 at the time, and having just moved into the apartment, feared that the damage would immediately result in his being evicted. Fortunately, when next his landlord came by for an inspection, the hole in the wall was not noticed as distinct beyond any of the apartment's already existing inadequacies. There was, poking through this hole, a thin layer of insulation, which the landlord insisted was not asbestos. "You should count yourself lucky the place even has insulation," he had said. "Most places don't, you know," he had gone on to claim. The hammer and the fist were by no means isolated incidents. The hum more often than not compelled Charles to violence or self-destructive tendencies. He had, while reading Reader's Digest, learned of the term l'appel du vide, or the call of the void, a fairly common phenomena where, when standing on a high ledge or driving against oncoming traffic, many people feel a brief urge to jump or to turn into said traffic. It was this common phenomena that Charles had then attempted to convince himself was what he experienced on an almost constant basis. The term suited Charles well in his quest for self-normalization and allowed himself to continue to justify never seeking psychological help. Since the incident with the hammer, Charles had experimented with different ways of ignoring or drowning out the hum. There had been meditation, heavy exercise, loud music, and self-medication. The latter he had depended on the most, and, having landed him in hospital twice, it had been the most disastrous. In small doses, alcohol and drugs had managed to dull the hum, but he was never able to limit himself to small doses. And during the inevitable large doses, it was his conscious mind that took the backseat and the hum that was given full rein. And when the hum was given full rein, terrible things would follow. Charles had not had a drink now for 2 years. Not since the bar fight that had seen him sent to Alcoholics Anonymous, which had encouraged the church. That is to say, he had not had a drink for 2 years until, apparently, last night. Had it been at the lunch with Mandy that he had had a drink? Or was it afterwards that he drank, either celebrating the lunch or trying to forget his failure? Charles pushed his knuckles into his eyes and tried to drown out the pounding headache that filled his head and the buzzing that filled the room. Charles was 20 and he had just left church with Mandy. Charles was always good at hiding his compulsions around Mandy. Mandy did not know of his past, and when she asked him, he told lies and half-truths, figuring that to do so was okay just so long as he himself remained genuine. Lunch had become coffee, and coffee had become dinner, and their Sunday following church had taken them from a deli to a cafe to a restaurant to a bar. Charles had drunk and become drunk because Mandy had asked him if he drank, and he couldn't think of an excuse to tell her as to why he didn't. As liquor was consumed, his ever-present hum faded into the dullness of his inebriation, and the lines between his own actions and those he was compelled towards were blurred. Despite his usually photographic memory, Charles' recollection of this time became stilted and fragmented. 3 lines of conversation could be called up to recollect entire hours, and locations became confusingly interchangeable. He could remember dancing, laughing, and briefly being concerned that Mandy would judge him for his small, grease-stained, bug-ridden apartment. Somewhere between 1 and 2, Charles' memory ceased entirely, annoyingly during the pleasant recollection of kissing Mandy. Following this moment of total blackout, there was nothing more than a void in time, then his awakening to the pounding of his headache, the uncertainty of the night before, and his usual hum from within replaced by the strange buzz from beyond. It was late in the morning, and Charles was back in the present once more, in the overly warm dimness of his small bedroom. It had been hours since Charles had first begun to attempt his recollection of the day prior, and hours more before the thudding in his head dulled and the familiar hum returned. The hum was within, and yet the buzz he took to be of the same origin remained beyond. They vibrated in uneasy unison, the hum within and the buzz beyond. Charles was compelled out of bed, a bed which he had slept in alone. He now noted this with some significance as he moved from under the grease-stained ceiling past the small asbestos hole and towards his bedroom door. It was, he realized with dull confusion, within his own apartment that the memory of he and Mandy kissing had taken place. Where then was she now, he wondered, and had they parted on good terms? As the hum drove him towards the door, the buzzing grew in intensity, and standing at its precipice, Charles felt certain that the door itself was the source of the outer vibrations. Vibrations that, Charles now realized with a cold sweat, were doubtlessly beyond. A noise that existed outside of his own mind and head, and existed with true form independent of himself. Charles half expected, when taking the doorknob in hand, for it to rattle about wildly, and was shocked to find it entirely inanimate. And yet the buzzing grew louder. It increased and grew with further intensity. The buzz from beyond the door. The buzz that vibrated with neither compulsion nor desire, and yet buzzed all the same. Without want or urging, Charles swallowed deeply and turned the handle. Is this courage, he wondered, and pushed on through. Numbness. Charles' hum had grown silent, or was simply drowned out as the buzzing confirmed itself not to be the product of his own mind, but the scream of the black swarm. The buzzing, the winged beat of the uncountable masses which moved with hellish speeds and were the storm clouds of man's darkest days. The apartment was warm, sticky, and humid. The air conditioner had never worked, and in summer the apartment was prone to bugs, spiders, and flies. Flies that had now returned en masse, swarming, crawling, and wriggling their way inside, through the windows that could not seal tightly, under the drafty doors, or through the cracks in the walls that led to other apartments. In countless numbers they had congregated, and in their black mass they swarmed the brutalized remains of his saviour Mandy, in the dim, unpleasant apartment, and the warmth of the late Monday morning. Thanks for listening. That was Call of the Void from my second collection of short stories, Screams from Beyond the Crypt. I seem to be losing my voice a little today, so fingers crossed it held together in the end there. If you enjoyed the story, make sure you subscribe. I do one every 2 weeks, and with all of that said and done, thanks for listening. I am Darkwell Bled, and I will see you next fortnight.